have mentioned the first two objectives of capital budgeting. We talked about capital expenditure control, finding the right source of funds as the second objective. The third one is about selecting the viable projects. The ultimate of this, of going through capital budgeting process, is to make the best choice out of all available projects alternatives to you. So if you do that, you want to find a way to ensure that at the end of the day, the decision you are taking will maximize the shareholders' wealth and the returns on their investment. Hence, the ultimate goal of capital budgeting is to identify and select projects that will maximize the shareholders' wealth or the return on their investments. This objective is very, very important. If you have not gone through this of the capital budgeting process, you are not likely to be able to make the best choice, to make the best decision that would add value to the shareholders' investment. Or even if you add some value, it might not be taken to be the maximum or the best possible choice if you have taken the decision randomly without going through the process of capital budgeting. So part of the objective is that you want to ensure that you select viable projects that will add benefits to the shareholders' investment. Features of capital budgeting. What are those things that we consider to be the features, the peculiarities of capital budgeting? Number one, capital budgeting involves dealing with huge amount of funds. I mentioned when I was introducing this topic, when you had to invest in a tricycle business that require about 700,000, 1 million naira. So you need huge amount of funds. So that is one of the features of capital projects, and it's involved also in capital budgeting. You'll be dealing with huge amount of money that runs to millions, and for major big projects you talk about billions of naira. You'll have heard the government will say that they are constructing a road from Lagos to Ibadan that will cost 600 billion naira. So that's a huge amount of money. So depending on the size of the projects, the size of the funds required will also be very huge. High degree of risk. You are going to be dealing with high level of risk, and the objective in the concept process of capital budgeting is to ensure that you minimize the risks that are inherent with the project. You must be able to estimate the level of risk associated with the project and find the best possible way of minimizing such projects through the process of capital budgeting. You also need to know about the future competitive trends of such capital expenditure decision. Capital projects talks about the future. It's futuristic in nature. You are only projecting. You don't have control over the future. You don't even have a proper understanding of what the future would present to you. The future is filled with a lot of uncertainties and risks that you do not know at this today. Anything can happen. Take for instance, last year, 2019, so many people had projected that they wanted to kickstart certain capital projects in the year 2020. Nobody knew when they were making such budgets and putting all of those plans in place that we would enter the month of February and March and now dealing almost throughout the year to be battling with the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is part of the challenges that are associated with capital projects. You do not know the future. But it's expected that you should adopt techniques that will help you to incorporate the risk that are associated with the future into your planning. Difficult decision. Of course, future decisions are very difficult to take. So the management needs to be abreast of so many situations around them, be able to analyze critically and take the decision. Of course, difficult decisions, when properly analyzed and taken and executed, will yield maximum or optimum return at the end of the day. So such firms will laugh at the end of the day if they are able to take such difficult decisions. Estimating large profits. Of course, estimation of large profits, we are talking about huge returns that will accrue to the firm almost into perpetuity. The firms that are quoted on the Nigerian Stock Exchange today, some of them date back to pre-independence of Nigeria. We all know about the case of Lever Brothers, the Cabri. These are companies that have been there for years in Nigeria here, and they are still in existence up to today, and they will be there till eternity, all things being equal. So much profit will have been made, and it will continue to be made of such large organizations. Long-term effect. Decision you take today has implications on the long term. Whether it is favorable or unfavorable, it will affect the few projects into the future. Long-term projects affect the capital structure of the firm. The cost structure and changes in capital structure or capital you undertake, in most cases, will have effects on your capital structure. It may increase the fixed cost charges of your company, insurance charges, interest, depreciation, and rent, and so many other factors. So it affects the cost structure of the firm, and this needs to be taken into consideration when you are analyzing the project. How does this project affect the cost structure of the firm? Is it going to increase it, or help you to even absorb some of those costs, or eliminate certain costs that you were incurring before? Can it bring you some savings additional savings into the operations of the business, or it's going to jack up your cost? You need to take consideration of that. This is a very important feature of capital budgeting. Irreversible decision. The decision you have taken today is a top one, and in most cases, it cannot be reversed. Once you undertake decision, you have to face the consequences of those decisions. So decision is irreversible. This is another important feature of capital budgeting process. What factors affect capital budgeting? Number one, capital structure. The capital structure talks about the debt-equity mix of the firm. What's the ratio of debt to equity of the firm? So this factor is important because it affects your capital budgeting. And because capital budgeting requires huge amount of funds, this tend to tilt or affect the existing capital structure, because there may be need for you to take on more debt to issue additional equity. This changes the existing capital structure and must be considered. So, decision to undertake such a project may need to look at how the capital structure will be affected. The earnings of the company. If the company has stable earnings history, then it may plan massive investment projects on leverage funds. But at the same time, if the earnings history of the company has not been regular, has not been stable, then it may also affect the decision to undertake capital projects. If you have stable earnings history, that means that you can be trusted. The company can be trusted and capable of generating reliable future returns. But if it has been irregular, it may be a tough decision to convince potential investors to put funds down for you to undertake some future capital projects. Management decision to take a risk and invest in high value assets or holding similar plan also determine capital budgeting. So factors, the decision of the management, how you are able to convince the management to buy into the projects is a major issue that affects capital budgeting. Taxation problem. In taking capital budgeting decision, it's important to look at the issue of taxation. How does the tax structure or the tax policy of government affects the project in question? Do you have opportunity to get tax incentive? Do you have tax holidays? Or is tax rates as attached to this type of projects so high? Or is it so low? Have there been concessions? All of these ones are to be taken into consideration when you want to undertake the project. Taxation may make a project to be accepted or rejected. So it's important that you consider the tax implications of that capital budgeting process that you're undertaking. The project economic value. The potential benefit that is the key attraction to investing. Consider the net present value, the internal rate of return of the project. How does it add value to the shareholders' wealth? Is it a profitable project or otherwise? If it's a project, then of course the tendency that the project will be undertaken, all things being equal, will be very, very high. So economic value of the project is very important. How does it add to the shareholders' wealth? What's the net present value, internal rate of return, and so many other key parameters for assessing the benefits of capital projects would be taken into consideration to decide whether to undertake the project or otherwise. Then government policy. What is the government policy as far as this project is concerned? Is it a project that the government will support? Is it a project that the government has banned that you cannot undertake? And so many other factors. What is today's government decision? What will be its implication into the future as far as this project is concerned? So these are important things you need to take into consideration. If government project policies are favorable to the project, then it's a welcome position that will encourage you to undertake such a project. Economic environment is another factor. You need to consider the macroeconomic variables like the GDP, inflation, employment, population, and the structure of the population. All of these factors are very important in undertaking a project. If the economy is experiencing some downturn, certain projects may not be attractive in the short run, except if the situation turns down and it becomes economy revives, then the project becomes attractive. So you need to know how the economic environment will affect the project in the short run, in the medium term, and then in the long term. So you finally take a decision to undertake such a project. Capital budgeting process. We are looking at the basic steps that you need to undertake so that you can come up with the capital projects. You can make a final decision. The first one looks at identify the potential investment opportunities. What are those opportunities available to you? Scan run. Identify series of projects that are in tandem with your goal, your needs, what you like, or the business of that organization. So having identified all those project opportunities, then the next one is to pull them together and evaluate them. The next step is evaluating and assembling the investment. Pull all of them together and take them through proper investment evaluation techniques. And then you now come up with, identify the projects and select them based on series of project selection criteria. Like you can use your NPV, the net present value technique, the internal rate of return, which is IRR, the profitability index, analytical technique, and so many of such techniques. So at this stage, you are evaluating the project and then select the project based on the ability of the project to meet the criteria or decision scenario that has been set by the management, and the threshold that management has given that those projects will meet the criteria for project selection has been set by the management. Proposal decision making. Then the next level is to now make a decision. You have done the project evaluation, having pulled them together, and then the next one is to take a decision to undertake these projects. The next leg is to now look at capital budgeting and apportionment. You have now done that. You are now to apportion the funds to the project and start for the purpose of implementation. Having done that, then go ahead to do the implementation of the project. In the process of implementation, ensure that you keep proper monitoring of the project in the process of execution. Keep track of the cost analysis that you have identified and projected at the level of this capital budget analysis, so that you control your costs. If you don't do that, there could be huge variance between what you have targeted and what you are currently spending. Now, consider the case of capital budgeting and apportionment. Having taken the decision to undertake the project, the next stage is to allocate funds for the project that you have selected. It could be one project, two projects, or more of that. So allocate funds to the projects, and then after having done that, the next leg is to consider the implementation. This is the point of executing the project. While executing the project, you must ensure that you keep track of the scenarios that are playing up at the point of implementation, and then comparing that with what you have budgeted. If you don't do that, at the end of the day, you may have a huge variance between the budgeted funds or costs and then the actual that you are incurring at the point of implementation. So if it is important, this stage is very, very important. Some projects that were hitherto taken to be viable at the stage of planning or capital budgeting stage may end up not being as profitable as estimated due to poor implementation. So it is very important. The last stage is to talk about performance and feedback. After you have completed the implementation of the implementation or execution of the project, then you continue to look at the performance of the project. How is it performing? How much income are we generating? Are we generating as much as we had expected? Are there other opportunities that we never thought of that are now coming up? How do you see such opportunities? And then continuously, you do continuous monitoring and evaluation of the projects, and then giving appropriate feedback to the management for necessary adjustments, improvements, and subsequent appraisal. So it is important that we take this process as very important. These stages are very important. You cannot afford to jump any of these items listed in the stages of our capital budgeting process. Capital budgeting techniques. What are those techniques that you require for evaluating projects? We talk about, at this stage, we talk about evaluation. You want to put value to the project. You want to assess the viability of the project. You want to know whether the project will be acceptable or otherwise. Is it profitable or not? How much returns can you get from these projects? This is the basic objective at the stage when you want to apply the capital budgeting technique. There are two broad groups of techniques that we use in capital budgeting. We will talk about the traditional method, and these alternatively are also called non-discounted cash flow method or techniques. Under that, you have a payback period method and accounting rate of a return method. The second group, we have modern methods, which is also called the discounted cash flow method. Under the discounted cash flow techniques, you have the net present value, internal rate of return, and then the profitability index method. Let me just briefly talk about what you have under each of these two broad categories. The payback period. The payback periods as a technique helps you to determine the period of time within which the project cash flows will pay back the initial outlay, the total amount that you have invested in the project. How many years and many months will it take the project to return the cash that you have invested in the projects? So, for instance, if you have bought a tricycle for 500,000 naira and on a monthly basis, the tricycle brings in revenue of 100,000 naira. 100,000 naira every month will translate to 1.2 million. Then the payback period in this case will not be up to a year. You have spent 500,000 naira and you have generated a cash flow of 1.2 million. We are generating a cash flow of 1.2 million. In this case, all you need to do is to say the cash flow you have generated and divide it by the initial outlay. That is 1.2 million naira divided by 500,000 naira, or 1.2 million divided by 0.5 million. Of course, you will realize that within a year, you'll be able to pay off all the money. In less than 1 year, you should be able to recoup all the money you have invested. Maybe within 6 months, you should be able to pay that off. I hope the payback period technique is understood. Just compare the funds you have generated from the project with how much you have invested in the project. That's the payback period technique. The accounting rate of return. This is a little bit more involving. The accounting rate of return relies on the accounting estimates, the accounting records. It looks at issues of the profit of the project, profit coming from the project, and then relative to the amount you have invested. In this technique, you want to look at profit over a period of time, maybe 5 years profits that will come from these projects, and then compare it to the initial investments. There are different methods of looking at this, but what we are considering basically is want to see how much return, what's the rate of return, and the higher the rate of return here, the more acceptable the project is to you. Now, the payback period and the accounting rate of return, these two techniques under the traditional method are very, very easy to employ. They are very fast, they are understandable, they are not too rigorous to be understood by an average person. So that makes them attractive as the first method of screening out projects, because they are very simple to understand. But part of the challenges associated with this traditional method is the fact that they don't take the time value of money into consideration. Because, you are familiar with time value of money, in which case we are saying that the value of 1 naira today is higher than the value of 1 naira that you will receive at the end of the year. So that's why we call them non-discounted cash flow technique. So we also say they don't take risk into consideration. These are two key drawbacks that are associated with the traditional method, including the payback period and then the accounting rate of return method. But they are equally good for screening projects, especially at the preliminary stage. The second group, modern methods, the discounted cash flow method. The first one looks at the net present value. This net present value internal rate of return profitability index, they both use the time value of money, and what is common to all of them is that future cash flows are discounted to their present value and then used as a basis for determining the acceptability or otherwise of a project. The net present value actually gives you the actual naira value that is expected to be added to the value of the firm if the project is undertaken at the end of the day. If a project generates positive net present value, the project will be taken to be acceptable. But if it produces a negative net present value, that project will be taken to be unacceptable or unviable. So, and the project will not be advised for execution. That's about the net present. So that the higher the net present value, positive net present value, the more attractive the project will be. So that the project that produces 5,000 naira present value will be more acceptable, will be first considered for acceptance, all things being equal, compared to a project that generates 4,000 naira net present value. The internal rate of return is also called the hurdle rate. It is used to determine the rate of return on a project after the cash flows have been discounted, and it's a very important index for project evaluation. So it's easy and straightforward to compare projects of different sizes, different projects of different features and times lifespan and things like that. So the higher the internal rate of return, the more acceptable the project will be. So that a project with 10% internal rate of return will be accepted before a project that generates 8% internal rate of return. So the higher the internal rate of return, the more attractive the project will be. Then profitability index. The profitability index is also a technique that is used for evaluating projects and ranking projects. Actually, when you have many projects that you want to rank, perhaps they are not also generating the same cash flows, the initial outlays are different there. You can use the profitability index. Profitability index it could be done in different ways, but more importantly, what you do is to compare the net present value of the project with the initial outlay of the projects. The net present value of the project, and compare that with the initial outlay. Or some other times you may also use the gross present value relative to the initial outlay of the project. So these are the key things that we look at when you look and we consider the modern method. Don't forget, we said that the modern method involves the use discounting the cash flows of the projects to their present value. And in this case, they consider the time value of money, and that makes the method under the modern methods more attractive and considered as the most critical techniques for project evaluation when you compare them with the traditional method. This brings us to the end of the study session 4, and I hope you have enjoyed this session. Thank you for listening to this presentation.